Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. I'm Alistair Chariton, your host this week. Our main topic is ethical supply chains, ensuring integrity and responsibility, and reporting misconduct. Before that, we'll discuss a topical news story related to that main subject, and we invite you to join in with the chat on the chat box on screen. Please do take part, add your comments, experiences, questions, and we'll try and respond to as many of those as we can, either on the chat box itself or picking up some of those points in the discussion. And there will be a coveted Supply Chain Talk mug awarded for the contribution we find most useful. So do keep those comments coming. Let me now introduce our three expert guests this week. And the first of these is Tom Otley, who is Director for Sustainability at Ori Clark. Welcome, Tom. And
Thank you. Thanks so much. Sorry, just playing around with my camera.
Indeed, enthusiastic, eager
Yeah.
to get on the show. Tom is a barrister with a master's in energy and environmental law, and he now works with the multidisciplinary firm of Ori Clark as a sustainability consultant. And in his spare time, Tom's a licensed lay minister in the Church of England, and he's on the Board of Finance of St Albans Diocese, and he's also a windsurfing instructor. Our second guest is Ray Hassan, who is third-party risk manager at Vitality, the private health and medical insurance company. Ray leads the third-party risk management function there, focusing on ensuring vendor compliance and mitigating risks across the organization. And a fun fact about Ray, he was a production assistant, which he modestly says is a T-boy, at the Sawmill studio while Supergrass were there recording In It for the Money. So a distinguished musical career before joining Vitality. Welcome,
Good
Ray.
afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
And finally, Elisa Simbine is the commercial director at Belu Technica in Mozambique. She's a skilled professional in engineering and procurement, dedicated to optimizing operations at Belu Technica and enhancing supply chain efficiency in Mozambique. In 2022, Elisa was recognized as one of the top 100 most influential women in supply chain in Africa by the Association for African Women in Supply Chain, and that highlights her impact in the industry. And outside work, Elisa is deeply devoted to God. She finds balance through fitness, and she cherishes Sundays spent cooking for her family, blending faith, strength, and togetherness. So it's lovely to have all three of you join. Welcome. And
Thank you for having me.
That's great, yeah. And let's turn to our news item. This was reported, as is often the case, in many publications, but we picked it up on the BBC News website, covered by last week by Esme Stallard, their climate and science reporter. And it's headed up Red Tractor advertisement banned for misleading environmental claims. So just to explain a little bit of the background, particularly for non-UK audience members, the Red Tractor scheme is the UK's biggest certifier of farm products on supermarket shelves, and it assures 45,000 farms in the UK. So it's a big scheme. It was established 25 years ago, so this is a very well-established scheme. And the story is that in 2021, Red Tractor aired an advertisement which said, "From field to store, all our standards are met. When the Red Tractor's there, your food's farmed with care." And if you look on the story on the BBC, you'll be able to find a link to the advertisement. So that advert ran for 2 years, and then in 2023, the environmental group River Action brought a complaint saying the scheme was greenwashing and urged supermarkets to stop using it. And it said that the that the advertisement was misleading because it sort of implied there was a high degree of environmental protection, and that in fact there was not evidence that that was the case. So the Advertising or Standards Authority investigated for 2 years, which is one of their longest ever investigations, and concluded they upheld the complaint and said there wasn't sufficient evidence about environmental laws being met. And so the advertisement has now been banned, and River Action has welcomed all this and has said that Red Tractor scheme was misleading the public. In contrast, of course, the red tractor scheme, as you would expect, has pushed back very strongly, saying the findings are flawed and that they never implied any huge environmental claims because the core purpose of the red tractor scheme is around food safety, animal welfare, and traceability. So there's a few more details, obviously, in the story. So a really interesting debate here because this is a really comprehensive scheme. It's been running for 45 years. Its focus is on food safety, animal welfare, and traceability, as mentioned, rather than environmental standards. However, I looked on their website, and in fact, when you look at the documentation published on their website, it talks about the requirements for storage of manure and animal waste and slurry and so on. So it seems really surprising when they've got those standards defined that the ASA said, they were almost, as if there were no environmental standards. And the Red Tractor enforced these standards because they said themselves on their website that in January to March this year, in just 3 months, they suspended the certification of 779 of their members. So that's, not an insignificant number, 800 out of 45,000. So a few percent of their members have been suspended in just 3 months, and 53 members had their certification revoked altogether. So if River Action had a concern, should they have gone to the ASA? Is that really the best way to raise those concerns? Have they actually caused really quite a lot of harm by undermining the scheme? So, Tom, what are your views on this one? It's a really interesting one.
It really is, yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of different angles. I mean, it's a good point that you said at the end. Is that the way that River Action, I think it was, should have gone about it? I mean, we don't know all the background of what their representations to Red Tractor before, and perhaps no one had heard of River Action, and now they have as a result of taking the action. So they might say that was some free publicity or fairly cheap publicity for us. I mean, I think what I found interesting about it, obviously, like most consumers, I've heard of Red Tractor, and if I'd have not looked at any of the background behind it, I might have thought it was more to do with food safety, transparency in a supply chain. I'm not sure that I would have necessarily thought anything about the environment, partly, I guess, because it's a red tractor, not a green one. And partly because they don't say much about environmental standards. I take the point that you found out stuff about, manure and whatever else on the website. What I thought was interesting was Red Tractor's defense against this claim was basically, our advert never said anything about environmental standards, which is true. And that's not what we're about. And they also, in the ASA, in their representation to the ASA, which I did read, the legal document that they sent in, or their representations, they said that separate from this, they'd done some research with consumers, with people who, like me, shopping in supermarkets. And those people, very few of them thought they had anything to do with the environment. Maybe because of the color, maybe because there were no claims made. So you'd think from one point of view, Red Tractor have been unfairly treated. However, as you probably saw from the news report, what was really interesting and quite embarrassing for the supermarkets is they had quotes from both Tesco and Morrison's, and they misunderstood what the Red Tractor mark meant. So, for instance, Natalie Smith, Tesco's head of agriculture, said certification schemes play a key role, and Red Tractor's established itself as a mark of quality standing for environmental protection. And Morrison said something similar. Now, of course, those are, Red Tractor is a certification, but of course, if the people selling us the food, the Tesco's and Morrison's, are confused about what Red Tractor means, you can hardly blame, I guess, the charity for saying, hold on a second, there's confusion here, and it's Red Tractor who's causing the confusion. I think Red Tractor might say, it's not us causing the confusion, it's Tesco and Morrison. Perhaps you should have sued them. But so it's a complicated one. I'm not sure consumers were confused, but it's funny that funny in an awful way, Tesco and Morrison's are confused.
That's a really interesting point, Tom. No, thank you. Ray, what did you think about this one, the decision and the whole action that's been taken?
I think Tom's just made some really fantastic points around the two sides of the story, as well as the kind of ethical conundrum that we would be faced with something like this about, is it the right approach? And, are we going after these people because we assume that they have a responsibility towards a better environment, or is it because they are a certification function that provides assurance for the product that goes out to the consumers? It is a bit of a treacherous water to navigate. It's a very morally, you could look at it from both sides of the argument. Is it the best way? The way they approached ASA? Probably not for fixing the pollution itself, because there are better way to get at it. Environmental authorities would have been a much more effective function to mitigate the actual pollution-related point, but to increase a customer sentiment, a public sentiment, to increase and challenging perceptions and influencing customer trust. The ASA is probably the quickest way to the greatest number of years that the River Trust could have gone to. So there might have been some strategic pointing towards, which route shall we take to get the greatest number of sort of likes, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Ray. And Lisa, I mean, I sort of appreciate it might seem a bit remote to you in Mozambique. I don't know what sort of schemes there are there, but interested to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Steve. I think this case reminds us that certification is a tool, not a guarantee. So that tractor has a long story and detailed standard, but what it shows is that even with all the documentation, what really matters is how those standards are lived out in practice. So if River Action went to the ASA, I don't see it as a procedural move. I see he has a signal. It's a way of saying that if you are communicating that to the public that your labor stands for ethical and sustainable farming, then those claims must hold up in reality, not just on paper. And that's exactly where responsibility as supply chain professional comes in. We can rely only on certification. We have to make sure that assurance systems behind the labels like verification, like enforcement and continuous improvement are actually working. Because at the end of the day, it's about trust. It's all about trust. Public confidence in ethical supply chain depends not only on standards existing, but on how consistently we are enforced, we are monitored, and we are communicated. So this case remind me to all this way of trust.
Yeah, no, thank you, Elisa. Yeah, and I think it does sort of highlight, it's really important, the communication of these schemes and just being very clear on what they stand for and so on, and I guess communicating really clearly to all stakeholders. Okay, well, it certainly leads well into our main topic. So as a reminder, that is ethical supply chains, ensuring integrity and responsibility and reporting misconduct. And the first agenda point we have to discuss is using audits, certifications, and technology to help verify ethical sourcing. And I think as the Red Tractor story shows, I mean, even long-established schemes close to home, this is a domestic scheme in the UK, can't cover everything. And so I guess, there's a question of how effective can audits and technology be? And I think also this fact that, as we recognize, nothing can be perfect, whatever standards you set and however much you audit and so on, it's never going to be perfect. So how do we sort of communicate realistically the scope of the scheme without sort of undermining it itself? So quite a few things to think about there. Tom, I don't know what you wanted to pick up on.
Yeah, I mean, well, sort of, I guess starting backwards in one sense, because if it's the communication part of it as much as anything else, both internal communication and external. And I think that's where, particularly with the new laws that are coming in, companies have to be very, very careful. So I think most people on the call, most people watching it, will think to themselves, look, we do everything we can. And they'll have in their mind all of the things that they are doing. But you've also got to be aware that when those are communicated, often you're not the one doing the communicating. You may have a marketing department, you may have an internal comms. And I think sometimes that's where the disconnect can happen. And it's that horrible sinking feeling where you as the expert suddenly see the communication that's being done, perhaps internally, perhaps being done by someone else in the procurement team, or often, or sometimes being done externally. And you think, Sort of, but not really. I don't think we can go quite as far as, I've done what I can and we've done what I can, and I'm relying on, say, a certification or an audit trail, but possibly we may have gone too far with some of those claims. And that's when, there are NGOs, as just been, indicated in the previous story, but there are people who will take you to task on that. And if it's not the ASA, it might be a European authority. I mean, we've seen examples of, KLM the airline KLM has always tried to do the right thing, but their catchline, fly responsibly. They were taken to task for that. The same with compostable, say, coffee pods. Yes, they are compostable, but it's an industrial process. If you put them in the compost at the end of your garden, they'll still be there in 100 years. So, you do have to be very careful about the claims. So I think it's one thing to rely on internally on the various certifications, or perhaps you're member of SEDEX, you're using SEDEX, for instance, which is very good, but you have to be careful that doesn't get misunderstood internally to end up with an external communication that then can get you into trouble.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom. Ray, what do you think? I mean, because I guess a risk about being, I mean, you've obviously got to be honest and accurate in your communication, but the risk is if you're too honest and accurate, people might just think, oh, well, I don't really care. It's just all too complicated and nothing really works. I'll just chuck everything in chuck everything in the general waste, and who cares, and choose what I want to buy.
It's a very, very interesting point. For us in financial services, for us, trust is a currency. Is central to how we protect our customers, our partners, our license operators, and it gives us the autonomy to do good social changes in Vitality, at Vitality, and across our industry specifically. Our supply chain is not just factories or freight. They're mostly data processor, cloud provider, medical networks, claim handlers, marketing partners, professional services, right? So these risks span across human rights, data privacy, financial crime, environmental impact. So we have to be very rounded in our approach to how we have those vendor, third-party supplier, whatever term you want to use, engagement. So we have a very strong, very clearly articulated and value-aligned supply code of conduct. And we always embed our supplier chain with that supply code of conduct, which gives them very clear, articulate points to refer to. And also, there are some demands that we ask of them that they have to abide to. If there's let's say, for example, if it's being used, if some kind of production is being used, we always make sure that there's a human rights assessment been done, that it's subject to audit. So there's no modern slavery in the chain of our production. Where there is data being transported out of UK, we make sure we have additional checks and balances in place. So whilst it's not a silver bullet, audit, the certification technology, these are built into our pre-contract due diligence. So before we even have a relationship with a vendor or a third party, we ensure that we are satisfied internally that they are ethical and they are like us to do business with.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. Lisa, I mean, Ray was mentioning there, supplier codes of conduct. I'm sure you have codes of conduct. I guess there is always that question of just how much effort and how much ability do you have to use audits and technology to be confident that your suppliers are complying with the code of conduct. I wonder if you make use of anything to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start. I can say that audit, certification, and technology are not absolutely essential, but they are not a full story. And audits and certification give us structure, they set expectation, they create accountability, and they make good practice visible. But technology then help us go further, giving us real-time data and traceability than traditional audits can capture. But none of these three tools are perfect. They depend on people, they depend on culture and on integrity across all the value chain. And that's here that I agree with Tom that communication here is key. So instead of claiming for perfection, we need to be transparent about what these systems do cover and what these systems do not cover. So when we explain the clear scope, that certification verified a moment time, that the audit test the compliance and the technology track signals, we can actually build trust here, because honesty about limitation is not a scheme. It don't weak that doesn't weak the scheme, but also he strained the credibility. Here at Belutechnica, we recognize that the paperwork is not enough. That's why we are developing the traceability tools to track procurement activities, from supplier selection to contract performance. So this tool will help us to visualize supply chain risks in real time, and that our partners uphold the same standards and the same commitment that we have.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. And we got a nice comment actually from Rebecca, an interesting comment from Rebecca Morgan. And she's commenting to say, in fact, with a specific sort of follow-up question in a way on this particular point, which is, where do you see the most potential for technology to improve visibility and accountability, and where would be more cautious? So I don't know, Tom, if you've got a view where you think technology can be a bit more reliable and actually can provide some good auditing, and areas where it's perhaps harder.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got great advantages. That's the first thing. But I think we have to be careful or cautious about what we're trying to achieve. So there's a lot of very good software out there that can tell you pretty much anything you want to know. It's knowing what you want to know and what isn't particularly material. So I think, first of all, having a clear idea of where you think your material risks are, perhaps that the highest rated risks. I mean, it might be around the environmental side, or it might actually be around, because of the nature of your supply chain, more social ethics. And a lot of the time, the old saying used to be, you need boots on the ground in all of these places. Of course, you can't do that. So then you use agencies, or you use the audit from a certification. Then it's like, well, how good is that certification? You'll be aware that, let's think of a different industry. In forestry, for instance, you'd think that would be very clear about where wood has come from, but there's been a lot of coverage by different NGOs about the effect that IKEA has had on, for instance, virgin forests in the Ukraine and other areas in Eastern Europe. So there you've got boots on the ground, but it hasn't really clarified what's going on. I think technology, the amount of information you get, I think a lot of the time, you look at it and go, okay, well, what do I do with this? Do I have someone who's dedicated to this to make sense of it? Or am I relying on an agency, or the software, basically, to throw up a report that then I'm going to act upon? And if I'm going to act upon it, is it to drop a particular supplier? Probably not. So probably to work with them, especially since probably the data came from them in the first place. So I think we do have to be cautious, careful, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money on that software or that solution, or in my case, that consultant. You'd want to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve, not just as a one-off, but of course as a continuing process.
That's a good point. It is about sort of thinking what is the focus of what you're doing, and again, back to that communication point, you can just say, look, this is our focus, this is our particular concerns, and you're not promising to cover every tiniest thing. Ray, what are your thoughts? And I think particularly sort of thinking about that Tom Bernth has added as a follow-up about, do you use supplier screening? Are there ways you can constantly scan the web? Another sort of example of technology. So it's interesting, you were mentioning you have a supplier code of conduct and many suppliers in lots of different fields, including, of course, your medical providers. So interested in your thoughts on that one.
Yes, it's a great point. It's a very interesting point. We rely on technology heavily to scan our third-party risk management landscape. We use a number of tools, and more recently, my team uses a lot more agentic AI to do some of the pre-contract due diligence. So I like to think of technology as the illuminator and not the outsourced judgment point. So we don't rely on technology to make judgment. We make that decision. I am the human in that loop, but we outsource a lot of the background checks and searches on different types of technology. And when the results are accumulated, we provide that human view of that risk. And to Tom and to Lisa's point earlier on, there's a materiality grading that's applied. So we don't go after all of our vendors with the same rigor or the due diligence requirements. We go for the most material ones in the most deepest, meaningful way. So we have proportionality applied throughout our supply chain. But we could not. I mean, we are a technological company. We could not exist without technological reliance, and it gives us speed, agility. It gives us ways of communicating and keeping constant vigilance out towards the risks that we look out for. And to Tom B's point, we continuously monitor webs and problematic sort of like connections for information security breaches. We do website scanning. We ensure before we have a relationship formed with a third-party vendor, we have a very good, deep view of how secure the two-way communications will be. So we use technology for almost every aspect of risk management.
Okay, no, great. And Elisa, how about you? Do you find there's particular ways you can use technology to monitor the ethical performance of a supply chain?
Yeah, now we are stand more on audits and certification that provide us a strong foundation of ethical sourcing. And ultimately, technology, we are running into technology to help us, to support us as judgment, not to replace it. So the goal is to make an ethical decision faster and more transparent. We use internal and third-party compliance audit, as well as international standards like ISO 9001, 40001, to access supplier performance and adherence of safety, environment, and ethical norms. And now we recognize that we don't have to work on paper only. That's why we are developed traceability tools to know how our suppliers are following the standards or not.
Okay, thank you. And that leads, I mean, there's a whole question about how you can potentially use technology to sort of monitor what's going on, leads to our sort of next point, which is about identifying and addressing unethical practices, recognizing red flags, and taking action. So I guess, Tom, you alluded to this as well. You know, if there's an issue, if you spot something, you know, do you immediately drop the supplier, or, you know, normally is it better to work with that supplier to address the problem?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
your thoughts on the
well,
best
I suppose it
approaches?
depends on just how egregious the red flag is. And also, of course, I mean, it depends how it came about. Say there was a whistleblower, you know, there's a moral responsibility to make sure that whether you're working with an NGO or however this came about, that you protect whoever it is who's, you know, notified you or however you found out about it. So I think there's a real human element. I mean, we can always think about our own reputations and the reputation of our company, which is very important. But at the same time, if, for instance, someone has been brave enough to say, look, you know, this, what you thought this business was, it isn't, and it's come to mind maybe through a union representative or something like that, it really does need very sensitively handling. So whether you drop the supplier or not is kind of a secondary thing. You've got to protect the people who, you know, have come to you with this red flag, if that's the way that it arose. So I think I wouldn't want to do a general rule about, you know, oh yes, just engage with them. They say, Mr. So-and-so said this about you. I'm sure you're going to fix it now. Well, the first thing you might do is fix him, and then, you know, and then sort out the problem. So, so I think that's part of it. I think also it depends. It depends how, when you do the investigation, what transpires. I mean, if it's something where this tier 2 supplier has been let down by a tier 3 supplier, it would be different than there's a, you know, widespread problem in one of your tier 2s where it's just modern slavery or bonded labor or something like that. So I think it would depend on whether it's an environmental, whether it's social, maybe it's a governance problem as well. So I think, you know, there's no one answer to it. The ones that I've come across, each one of them has been very specific. So I think when you look at the figures, I mean, I was just listening to something just the other day, and it said there's 130,000 people in the UK alone in modern slavery. So you tend to think that's just a consistent thing. You know, you have an image of what that is, but of course they're very, very different situations, and they all need dealing with in a different manner.
Yeah, and there have been, sadly, examples in the UK, even in really quite major supply chains. And I guess the question there is, you know, if you ditch a supplier, how do you ultimately try and remedy the problem for the poor, enslaved employees, or employees are getting paid a pittance, their passports have been stolen or whatever, and it's making sure that ultimately you don't cause even potentially more harm to them. Ray, what has been your experience or your thoughts on how you deal with problems when they get spotted?
Yeah, it's thankfully nothing's been experienced so deliberately catastrophic that we've had to deal with it immediately. But there are very, very few scenarios where we would, as an organization, consider immediate cessation of a relationship, if you deliberate fraud, perhaps, or a immediate sanctioned organization, or perhaps an evidence-based forced labor case. But in most cases, in any cases where we find some deficiencies in our supply chain, we will always look to work with our suppliers to ensure there's a sort of collaborative, corrective outcome. So we will always look to help our third parties in correcting the deficiencies that we have identified or has been identified through the other means. It shows that we're tough, but we also are committed to improvement in our supply chain. And to the interesting point about tiering and tier 2, tier 3, we call them fourth parties and nth parties. So we have a very good view of our third party base. We know their doings and how we interact because we have relationship management built in. We have ongoing and continuous supplier sort of metrics and SLAs and KPI reviews. So we understand how they operate. Where we are trying to get better, and I think the UK and the EU standards are heading that way, is that we're trying to build a deeper view of the fourth parties. So who's the suppliers of our suppliers providing that service, and where is that service coming from? So we are trying to build that depth of view so we understand that our fourth parties, who we don't have a direct contractual agreement with, may be the people who have these breaches that could have a downstream impact on our third parties and ourselves. And we will work to mitigate the same kind of control implementations in that field as well. So it's always, let's help our third parties improve their control environment rather than let's end this. And there's always contractual protection. So because we have such a detailed view of the engagement that we go in, we know from the outset where there could be potential risk in the future, and we build those into our contractual agreement. So, if there is a breach of trust or ethics, or just simple service agreements, then we have the autonomy to exercise those controls.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. No, thank you, Ray. And Elisa, what's your experience? I mean, did you, especially that issue that Tom and Ray have both mentioned, that when you're into a multi-tier supply chain, is very quickly the suppliers which are ultimately in your supply chain get very remote from you, and it's very hard to get direct information. So again, I wonder if you've got a perspective on how things work for you.
Yeah, that's a question that we face in a real life, and I'm happy that we are in the same page, because honestly, it's never black and white. When unethical practices are identified, our first instinct might be drop the supplier immediately. But if the goal is to build ethical and resilient supply chain, sometimes the best first step is engagement, not elimination. So I always say that we have to investigate, to validate, and then to act. If the issue of the result of weak systems, or if a lack of awareness, working with the suppliers to correct, it can create a real long-term impact. So it helps not only to raise what is the lack that we are facing on our company, but we can see the overall if we have lack on our standard. But of course, there are lines that can't be crossed. Issues like corruption, human rights abuse, or environment harm, that's deliberate. So those will require decisive decisions, decisive actions, include determination if necessary. So the best approach is combination of zero tolerance for misconduct with commitment to improvement. We are not here just to managing suppliers. We are here to shape values on the ecosystem that we operate. At Belutechnica, for example, we once identified a supplier who wasn't meeting safety and documentation standards. Instead of dropping them, we broke them into a review session. We shared our compliance checklist and we gave them time to align. And weeks within, they improved their safety control and their documentation process. And today, they are one of the best partners that we have. So it's not always black and white. We have to know if there is something like corruption, human rights, or environment harms that we don't have to discuss, or it's something that we can work together for good.
That's a really interesting example of a real example where you did work to make improvements. So that's a great to have that. And that sort of leads, I suppose, to our final discussion point, which is ensuring secure reporting channels, legal safeguards, and support systems. And I suppose it's interesting on that secure reporting, because I guess the trouble is if you've got a kind of bit of a dodgy supplier who knows that they're using a really low cost, even more dodgy supplier to them, you can ask them to report something, but won't they just make it up? Unless AI can sort of detect that. But I guess, with all this about secure reporting channels and so on, is the only realistic solution to have independent auditors, independent organizations, like, SEDEX, I think you mentioned before, Tom, and there's ones like Quima and so on as well. Or is it better for businesses to really invest and they just have to manage in-house because that's the way they can be a lot more confident in direct control and direct monitoring?
Is that one for me, or
it is Tom?
Oh
Sorry.
yeah. Well, I mean, ideally, yes, you'd do both, but it's a very narrow margin business. I'm aware of the fact that there may be companies on the call where they go, look, I can barely afford the technology to gather this data. It took me 3 years to get this, this bit of software, and okay, it's just about working, but it's all in silos, and I'm wondering whether I need another bit of software. The idea of either my team, someone from my team, or me going off to look at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 is unrealistic, and I can't afford to have people do it. So I think, it's where you bump up against what's the budget, what's your margin. Very large companies can do this, and they have to because their reputation is on the line. Smaller companies will then rely, I think, more heavily on certifications and the audit trail that goes with some of those certifications. So I think you have to be realistic, but at the same time, people who work in supply chain procurement, they are aware of the fact that every product and service, is created by people and has an effect on people and, I guess, the planet as well. So, if they hear about anything that is going to cause harm to either of those, they will do everything they can to do something about it. It might be working with the suppliers, or it might be ultimately moving to a different, sometimes more expensive supplier. But I think everyone understands the responsibility of it, but it can't be kind of an academic exercise, by which I mean, you can't, it's not a kind of, oh, look, if we were at university, this is the way that we would set something up, because every business is in the real world, and they're in a competitive environment. So I think that there has to be a recognition of what's possible and what the budget is, and the board ultimately has to understand, because they look, this is the way that we are doing things. I know that the people I know who work in procurement are constantly having that discussion where they'll have an edict coming down saying, well, we want everything to be fair trade, or we want everything to be this, but it has to be at a good price. And yeah, obviously, but these are the trade-offs. These are what we're actually doing here. So yeah, so I think it's a complicated area, and it really does depend on the resources of the company in question. You know, are they a disruptor and they've just started, or are they an incumbent but, you know, under pressure from the profit margin, that side of things? So I think, you know, it really does depend on each particular company and the market that they're in.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I mean, lots of interesting points there about that human element still, in terms of you can't just got to rely on everything from the data and theory and so on, and indeed just realistically, how much can you afford to put into this without, you know, becoming uncompetitive as an organization? Ray, again, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. So our mindset on this is trust but verify. So we trust our vendors. They do some audits themselves. They have self-certifications when it comes to certain elements of our engagement, but we also do some in-house verification. We have a absolutely brilliant sourcing team with lots and lots of experienced folks on the team who can look out for signs of left and kind of potential disruptions or headwind, if you'd like to call it. And we look at, when we dig deeper, we assess sanctions for certain vendors that are based outside of the EU jurisdictions. We do specific sets of assessments based on the nature and the geolocation of certain countries. But there's never a reliance on just certification. We use historical relationship, pre-existing understanding of that service in our industry. We also use a lot of our own verification methods to ensure that we are quite satisfied with what we are taking on. And on an ongoing basis, we ensure that we are happy with our vendor base. We just don't engage with somebody and then leave them to provide that supply. We ensure that they remain within our scope of tolerance. For any kind of tiered or fourth or nth party related issues, we are always relying on our third parties and some sort of external media to report on those subjects, but they're usually kind of like a post-event kind of notification. So we continuously look out for any issues and signs of issues in our supply chain, and where possible, we do rely on external certifications too.
Yeah. Oh, we've just got, you just pause there for a moment. No, that we got those points, Ray. Thank you. And I think it relates a little bit actually to the sort of follow-up question that Tom Bernth had a while back about, you know, the opportunity to not just do initial kind of screening and sort of submissions from potential vendors, but actually continually sort of scanning. And I know there are organizations that are constantly scanning the web to sort of see, you know, a small incident reported in local language miles away, which can still actually highlight that a vendor in your supply chain has been not performing as they should.
Absolutely.
It relates
that's always very much risk focused. So we will look at our material suppliers and we'll ensure that our information security office is constantly aware of what kind of traffic that's going through the digital connection between these organizations, to always look out for malicious intent or kind of, you know, cyber attacks. And that's a ongoing, every day, every minute kind of assessment. But some of the risk management methodologies that we deploy are cyclical. So depending on the materiality tiering, we may reassess them following a major event, or we may reassess them every 12 months or 24 months or so. So there's a continuous monitoring system built into it.
Okay, no, great. And Elisa, what's been your experience on secure reporting standards, reporting channels, and how will you continually monitor?
I think from my point of view, the answer lies in balance. Independent organizations play critical role. They bring objectivity, credibility, and the aspect specialized, they're expert. And that's hard for many companies to maintain internally, especially across complex and multi-tile supply chain. But outsourcing everything isn't the solution either. So ethical assurance has to become owned by the business because no one understands better your operations, your culture, and your risks better than you. So the strongest model, I think, is hybrid one. We use independent auditors for validated and benchmarking, but building an internal system that we continuously monitor, we continuously educate, and we engage with the suppliers. That's how we create culture of ethics, not just compliance. At Belutecnica, for example, while we are partnered with accredited inspector for ethical verification, we are also invest in internal supervision and training. So ethical and safety standards are reinforced day to day, not just during the hour. Independence gives you credibility, but ownership gives you sustainability. So for me, the hybrid one, it's what we use, and I think it's better because you can have credibility and sustainability in the same way.
Yeah, no, thanks, Elisa. That's a great point to finish on, actually, which is, it is really important. It's not just external auditors, it's reports and so on. It's everyone in the organization who deals with suppliers really being trained about what they should look for if they are uncomfortable about anything. So that's a great point to finish on. So I think we've had lots of great ideas, great issues. It's recognizing it's a balance. It's not just all data and external companies. There is that human judgment comes in. So I don't think we've got a single answer to this, but hopefully in the audience you've picked up some useful insights there. So it just remains me to award the Supply Chain Talk mug, and suddenly there's a flurry of comments coming in. But I'll pick on Tom. Yeah, I don't know if you're a desperate bid for cups at the end of it, but I'll go with Tom Bernth. I think a really interesting insight and question you had there, Tom. So a Supply Chain Talk mug will be on its way to you. Our next episode is in 2 weeks' time, 4 p.m. the same time UK time, on November the 5th. I think we actually have the clocks changing in between, so do make sure you check in your calendars on November the 5th, and that will be with Anna Maria Venica on the subject of proactive leadership for the next generation of supply chain innovators. So lots of interesting points combined there. So finally, thank you to my three expert guests, Tom Otley from Ori Clark, Ray Hassan from Vitality, and Elisa Simbene joining us from Mozambique from Belutecnica. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you to our audience for some great comments, and we look forward to you joining us in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye.